He's one of the most thoughtful, compassionate people that I've met, and I think a wonderful asset to the pharmaceutical industry. So welcome, Amrit.
Wonderful. You can say that again. That's quite all right. So, all right. So look, firstly, thank you very much to Professor Klitzman. Thank you very much, Samir. I really appreciate just the chance to have a small discussion that's only with the students and alumni. We've had some, I think, bigger talks, but to everyone online and to the folks here, I hope that we can make this very much a discussion. I've got a few, initial sort of background slides to share, and beyond the 5 minutes of background, I thought it would be good to have a specific discussion on careers, and that's after talking a lot with Samir, talking a lot with Bob, and also understanding that as the bioethics students go through the program, the need for career support is something that's of course there, but I think it's something also that the program takes very seriously and the program takes to heart. And now, my own perspective and experience on that is that in the end, what you do with your careers is really up to you. You are in the driving seat, and you are all going to be individual and distinct. But the way the program can really help is to put a lot of perspectives on the table. So today, my goal is to put one perspective on the table. And I started off calling it the industry perspective, but then I realized that that's the wrong word. It's not the industry perspective, it's an industry perspective. And I also thought it would be useful not just to share kind of the pros and the cons, the ups and downs of industry, but also to share a little bit about what I've seen since I've had a few different incarnations of career. In science and medicine, in more of a business role, and then in industry where I try to bring the two together. So that's kind of the remit of our discussion, and I hope that there's also a mechanism for everybody online to put in your questions, comments, whatever you would like to share, and I will try my best to address it. So with that said, let me give you a little bit of perspective. And these are, of course, I have a lot of good lawyers that work at Pfizer who tell me to remind you that these are all my viewpoints. And the nice thing is, I think that, careers are so individual. There are always going to be my viewpoints on this type of thing. There are no real generalities in this. All right. Should I just tell you, Lucas? Okay. The number one thing that I have learned, right, is that you have to know what your own values are. And you'll see this shining through. And what I've found, I've had a chance to talk with many people from the bioethics program one-on-one and in small groups of twos and threes, had a few lunches and coffees. And the one thing I'm always struck by is when I walk away from one of those discussions, you usually get a good sense of what a person's values are. So this person is very interested in the following. This person is very interested in that and is deeply committed to making an impact on public health. This person wants to start the next billion-dollar company. This person wants to have a very good work-life balance that allows them to look after their family and whatever. And it's usually some mix of those type of things. But this is very important, and I'll come to a little bit of why in a second. If we could have the next slide. And I thought I would give you two perspectives. One is that there's a company perspective, and the only reason I say that is because as you seek out careers and jobs, you will have to affiliate yourself with some institution. And this becomes important because the day that you have a bad day, or work with some not so nice people, or run into some kind of difficulty in the workplace, which is going to happen in the ups and downs of work, having some sense of connection and having some resonance with the organization that you're part of really matters. And that becomes sort of a common force. Now, some of you, if you think about biotechs or startups, you get to make your own company perspective. And some of you will, end up doing that. But I think this becomes very important. And, maybe I could just take a straw poll of the handful of people in the room. Does anyone know what Columbia's mission is? What Columbia's purpose is? Is that John? To enlighten, yeah. That's right. absolutely right. I think you saved a lot of your colleagues there who were floundering and looking for the right answer. I'm sure online everybody had the right answer, but absolutely, John. You know, and I think it is something like when it's translated into English, something like you know, in thy light lighten, right? And that becomes very important, you know, because you know, the mission of the institution is clear. There's a very clear set of values at Columbia, and if you go to another institution, you may find that it's very different. And similarly, in corporate life, institutions will have different missions. You know, some will have a mission to, you know, you look at Novo Nordisk, it's very focused on diabetes. You look at, you know, the Gates Foundation, very focused on, you know, three very specific public health goals, et cetera, et cetera. But I think this becomes important. And the second thing I want to share then was, from a personal perspective, how does that resonate with me, and how does that, you know, resonate with my own values? And I hope through that discussion we can, you know, have a little bit of grounding, and then we'll come to questions. So if we have the next slide. So the company perspective for Pfizer and for Upjohn is about breakthrough innovation. Pfizer is very focused on that, and for Upjohn, it's specifically focused on non-communicable diseases. And I did a talk here a while ago on that, and it's very clear that, you know, when we have some kind of tough decision to make, we go back to the mission and we say, well, look, is this going to make a big difference in non-communicable diseases? Recently, you know, we started up a few initiatives that are, you know, I can't say that they affect the profitability of Pfizer in any way, but they're very connected to the mission of non-communicable diseases. And I think if we didn't do that, then all of the people, honestly, like me, who are connected to that mission, it's going to be very hard to engage those people. And that's the truth of it. You're not going to get top talent unless you're able to resonate with that, and you're not going to be able to keep people motivated. So this becomes important, and this probably differs, you know, institution by institution, company by company, geography by geography. But this, in terms of career selection, becomes important. I can tell you, you know, I'll just have one little anecdote I'll add, is that a few years ago, I was at the FDA, and I was being interviewed for a role at the FDA, a very interesting role, and, you know, what got me to the interview was the mission of the FDA. I went away, I looked at it, and I thought, well, do I really want to move house? And, you know, how is this going to play into my bigger life and all of that? But when I went back to the mission and I saw the health of the American people, you know, there was just something that kept me awake at night about that said, my God, I would really like to be involved in that. I could not think of anything more inspiring. And this becomes important no matter what institution you're at. So, if we have the next slide, to give you then the personal perspective. Now, everyone is going to have a career journey, and I think one of the interesting discussions I've had with some of the bioethics students is, you know, what is the journey that you envisage? And I think there are sort of two lenses in the journey, right? So one is the formal lens, and what you can see is like a quick summary of my formal lens, and this is where people start with a resume. You know, they usually give you a piece of paper and they say, well, look, here's my formal journey, and here are the type of things I'd like to do. And that's interesting. In my case, you know, there are obviously some educational institutions. There was some work in the health service and, you know, looking after patients that influenced me a lot. And then there were some companies, and the companies themselves influenced me a lot, gave me different opportunities. But the real reason I wanted to show this is not so much the formal journey, because I think a lot of people can be, they can be, you know, quite sort of purposeful, deliberate about their formal journey. But if you look at this in a different way, and if I could have the next slide, Lucas, if I could get the next slide, thank you. What I really want to share was that there's usually an informal journey. And what you see here is the informal journey, which is, as you're at these institutions, I found that it's very often the experiences that you have, the people that you meet, the things that work out and don't work out that you learn from, that really influence you a lot and come back to influence, your values in many ways. Questions like, am I willing to work, 20 hours a day? Some people will put their hands up and say yes, other people will say no. Am I willing to travel extensively? Some people put their hands up and other people say nothing would torture me more, okay? And in my case, I found that, for example, I do want to be very involved in global health. It's important to me. I'm a global citizen by origin, and it matters to me that the work we do, and actually even going back to the FDA, which does play a big international role, but their role internationally became important to me because it was consistent with my own mission. I also found that I met certain people, and I often have a conversation about this, to find yourself the right mentors and find yourself the right advisors, because they will make, I think, the further you go on in career, an outsized influence on your career. And what I've found is finding mentors, and there's actually a few of them that I've encountered through the past here, I have often gone back to them time and time and time again. And in the case of my current career journeys, the person who 19 years ago first recommended me to think about Pfizer, I still write her thank you cards today and say thank you for giving me some good advice, that time ago. And what I've found is that maintaining a relationship with her over these years has just been extraordinarily invaluable. And I think for many of the students in the class, this becomes something that you have to be quite deliberate about and quite purposeful about. Look, who do I like? Who do I trust? Who understands me? And investing a little bit in that, and also not going to them just when you've got a career question, but keeping them regularly updated. Now, it sounds probably an antiquated concept in some ways, but I have found, if you go to people that you haven't spoken to for 5 years or had any contact with and say, I'm about to, have this big career moment, can you give me some advice? It's very hard for them to have context and perspective. Whereas if you've maintained, a network of relationships in a reliable, thoughtful way, that in the end becomes a very strong supporting force for career journeys. So I would definitely encourage that. The last thing on here I found is that I've also met certain patients, in my case, sort of influenced me a great deal. And I've heard, for example, I've been working on some particular clinical trial or some particular program, and then I've met a patient who, in a sense, has taught me that, we have fallen short, or we've not really solved the intent. And that's become very, very illuminating, because then you go back to the drawing board and say, what can I do differently? The last thing I'll say is, if you could have the next slide, is there's a big piece that's influenced me, which is the empathy with patients. And what I give you is this is just an example of a patient. And normally in the world of healthcare, you sort of classify patients by disease and so forth. It's a very, very sort of inanimate, distant classification. But actually, if you look at the world of the patient, and if we could have the next slide, in today's world, it's a very, very complex environment. And what I've come to conclude from that is that you could make a contribution in any one of those areas and still be true to your values, still be true to making a difference to patients, and still be true to in this case, if it's throwing light on new discoveries, or whatever it may be, still be true to mission in a lot of different forms of career. So it's important, I guess, to be open-minded about that. And now, if for example, if Google came to one of you now in the bioethics class, it's interesting, because you may be able to make a bigger impact on healthcare by going off to work for Google than you could, going to work for the VA. And these are the type of sort of open-minded kind of things that come up in career that I think it's worth keeping in mind. And if I could have the next one. The last thing I would say is that, as you go through this, I think it's important to get a sense that most people nowadays, and I'll just use my own example as a case, they don't really have linear careers. So, you know, if you pick a career path, now I initially picked a career path as a clinician, and the path for a clinician is very linear. You know, you have certain exams to pass, you have certain residencies to do, fellowships to do, and then you go off and you are an attending, and that is pretty much it. And then you might do some research and teaching, and you know, it's prescribed. It's very enriched, I mean, very powerful path, but it's pretty prescribed. But more and more people that I see now, and I enjoy, you know, learning through them, have portfolios of different activities that they do. You know, they're involved in this, and at the same time they're writing a book, and at the same time they're involved in this non-profit, and at the same time they're involved in doing some community work there, and there's some academic or whatever it may be. A lot of people have, you know, a portfolio of different activities that give them fulfillment in their career. And I encourage people to think about that, because that can help you to make career choices that will fit for you and your values in a, you know, in a world that actually offers a lot of opportunities. So it also becomes very important, and we'll probably come to this in a discussion in bioethics, because one of the observations that I've made is that there are very few people who will have a linear job as I am a bioethicist, and that's what I do all day. I don't think I've met anyone yet who does that. You know, maybe one or two people, yeah, but really not more than a handful. So this is going to be very important for the class here to realize that, you know, the 30, 40, 50 people moving out of the program every year, the reality is that the majority of them are not going to be professional bioethicists by career. But could it fit into their portfolio? Absolutely, yes. And that may be a way to think about how can this, you know, stand up in career. And the next one, please. You know, I won't ponder on this, but this is just, it's a quick thing that's used in my company to talk about careers. And I'll give you a few seconds to read it. There's nothing, you know, particularly insightful, but it just brings a little bit of process to how you think about careers. Now, the first thing is really thinking about uniqueness and assessing who you are. And even if you look at one class, everyone who's in this class is going to be unique in some way. But being self-aware of that and being able to, you know, state that and in a sense position that is going to be very important. I think the other thing is to look at, you know, opportunities that bring you fulfillment beyond the obvious. And that goes back to sort of the Google job, you know, and thinking about that. There are probably a dozen non-obvious for every obvious. And I always find that surprising, but, you know, it is certainly becoming more and more common today. Then the next 2, 3, and 4 are, I think, the probably the interesting ones. That it is important to lay out a roadmap, and I think particularly when people, you know, pass out of this program, it's very tempting to sort of look at the immediate next job. Look, I need a job, and I've certainly, you know, talked to students from this class who have been, you know, in that position. I completely understand that, but it's important also to be able to think about, you know, where could this lead, and what could be the next 2 or 3 steps, because if you don't have that in mind, you know, it can sometimes be difficult to get the most out of the job that you're doing and the role that you ultimately take. And that you know, is about this, the 4th one, which is when you're on a job and when you're in a particular role, you know, a little bit of, you know, particular career chapter, you can often make a dozen choices in that career chapter that may technically fall under the same job, but they will actually give you very, very different experiences. You know, and that's also something to be deliberate about. Like, it's very hard to say, listen, my career is I decided to join Pfizer, or I decided to join, you know, Novartis, or whoever it may be. That really says nothing. You know, in fact, there's a, you know, 100 different ranges of choices inside that, and that's also something that needs a lot of deliberation. So, if I could have the next one, next slide. And, you know, just to end up that as you're making these choices, it's also interesting to come back when you have deeper discussions and think about values. A book to think about at some point. I don't know David Brooks. This is not an advertisement in any way, but it's a point that he makes very eloquently. And if we just have the last slide. Thanks. And essentially the takeaway, I'll save you a few hundred pages of reading, is he asks you to think about eulogies versus resumes. And I think this becomes important because ultimately, I've certainly encountered, people who are eager to take a particular job, and then when you dig a little bit deeper, I sometimes find myself asking silly questions like, are you going to have fun doing that job? And when there's a great moment of pause, it kind of answers the question. So I would just urge you to think about that. All right, so I'm going to stop there. I hope that gives you a little bit of background, a few perspectives, and I think the best thing is we just have a discussion. And I think, Samir, if you guide me on any online questions, I'll be happy to jump in.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Amrit. I think everyone really appreciates your insights and thoughts. And if we have any questions from the floor here, please feel free. If you can just turn on the mic when you ask the question.
Hi. Okay. I'm just wondering, how did you make the decision to go from being a clinician to entering the industry, working in pharma?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Joyce. When I was in clinical care, and I think this is a very pertinent question because I know a number of the colleagues, students who have been in the bioethics program have been in nursing. And it's often actually been a feature of the nursing program, and there are lots of other sort of disciplines here. What I personally found that I got involved in research as a clinician, and I had some insights. So one insight was I spent a few years in a lab, and if I can be totally honest, I realized that I definitely do not want to spend my career in a lab. and I guess these are very important insights to have, because then you don't spend 20 years on it. I spent a few years in a lab, and I realized that, look, it's not a gregarious enough environment. It's not an environment where I get the level of people interaction and so forth that I like. But I do like the research. So is there a way you could have the research without having the lab? And that took me to clinical research, which I really enjoyed. And at a certain point, you get to a tipping point where sort of your hobby becomes your job, and it's very hard to do, a lot of things well. So you end up having to make a leap. And initially, the interesting thing, I went to Pfizer as a summer intern, which is like the most junior of possible jobs you can get. And what I realized in that summer internship was that, this is pretty interesting. It's a good environment. There's a lot of respect for people. My voice is heard. There are people around me that I can learn from. And the values of the organization are something that I could wake up in the morning for. I could feel excited about. And what started off as a few months has now ended up to like 2 decades, in industry, different forms, but that's essentially how the journey happened. And it was a bit of positive learning on something I enjoy, but a bit of deliberateness on, look, my version of research isn't in the lab. It's probably more out in public health. Good question, Joyce. Thank you. Professor Kovlik.
Work? Does this work? Okay. Sometimes you learn a lot from your patients. And you sometimes find that maybe we've let them down. We haven't really been doing all that we need to do. I'm reminded of an old saying that much I learned from my teachers, still more from my colleagues, but most of all from my students. So I don't know if in the medical context you learn from your medical professors. I know there was a woman at University of Edinburgh that you once mentioned to me. Who was a reproductive science researcher.
Yes.
And then from, no doubt, your colleagues. But sometimes even more from a patient. Is that what you'd say? So I'm wondering whether in the path to a career, you also learn about yourself from the way interactions with other people go. In other words, you learn that you have certain talents or you don't have certain interests. From in other words, people are a kind of a mirror to you of where you might go. And in other words, you not necessarily know where you're going next, but you get a feeling for that by how if you're open to people and you interact with people, or you find that you do better when you're alone in a lab rather than interacting. Do you think that that helps a person choose a career path, sort of picking up on when it feels really good to be working with certain people on certain things or talking to certain people in certain ways?
Yes. Well, look, thank you for the question. I think absolutely yes. It makes, I think what you're pointing to is that there's an iterative process. It's unlikely that you have a black and white answer and just pursue it. And you're often making, to get from A to B, it's probably not a line, but there are lots of little left turns and right turns that take you on the way. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I found, for example, in the last few years that I've been doing a lot of work in low and middle income countries, a lot of work, and specifically I would say in China. And in China, whilst there is certainly a need for medicines, there's certainly a need for appropriate diagnosis, all of the things that we think about here in typical healthcare, one of the biggest gaps is in awareness, okay, in health literacy and in public awareness. And what I sort of, it became as really a moment of epiphany from talking to, policy person, talking to patients, talking to, various other people involved in, different aspects of healthcare, was that there is such an awareness gap for something as what we would typically call something as simple as hypertension, right, that you could probably do more for healthcare overall simply by bringing awareness of a silent condition like hypertension than you could ever do by either providing pills or making sure that there's adherence or whatever it might be. Not that they're unimportant, but the net impact. So you come to this sort of strange realization that, by doing public education programs, whether it's a television program or whether it's a newspaper advert or whether it's an online social media program, you have alerted people to something that will probably make more net impact on more families, more patients, than as such like sitting in a clinic seeing patient after patient, which is probably what I would otherwise be doing. So, there's a lot of examples like that of where hearing and listening and, being willing to adjust can allow you to make an impact on your mission in a perhaps non-obvious way. I found the same thing, even with rare disease patients. I'd found that we have I've been involved in a lot of clinical trials that relate to common illnesses, but had not really been involved in rare disease trials. And now I found I've become so passionate and so engaged, really through one rare disease patient that I met. And this young boy really changed the course of how I think about healthcare. I went away and have got much more involved, and have, whether it is through research, whether it's through education, whether it's through my own personal time and non-profit work, I find that I feel compelled to sort of be involved in some way. And so, these are the type of things that change you. That changed then how I want to look at my portfolio of career. But it's a big influence listening to others. Good question.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Amrit, we have a few questions from our online participants. Helen Parfit is wondering, what roles in pharma do you see people in the bioethics, suitable for people in the bioethics program? And do you see a role in corporate responsibility perhaps as well?
Well, hi, Helen. Thank you very much for the question. I've had that question a number of times over the last few years, and I think it's actually one that probably has a number of different answers, and I've gone through the path of learning that with a few of the different bioethics students. So, first of all, you will have a number of people in the class who can probably give you, a lot of different perspectives on that. So I don't pretend that this is the only one, but what I've observed is I think that initially people sort of fall into a trap of I would like to be a bioethicist in the company. And I think the challenge with that, I'm just being completely candid here, but I think the challenge with that is in in a corporate environment, in an industry environment, when people engage bioethicists, they probably want a very sophisticated bioethicist. You know, they probably want a bioethicist with a real wealth of experience, and they may not have a lot of bioethicists. So if you get to choose one, you really want someone sort of near the top of their field. And that makes it very hard, I think, for graduates of a program like this, which I think certainly puts you, high up, but it's probably not going to make you a world thought leader in bioethics, right? And that I've observed that because I myself have gone through, the path of setting up a bioethics department, of realizing who we want there, who we really need to do the job well, and so forth. So the first thing I would say is I probably would not pursue that as a singular career path. Your question on corporate affairs, I could absolutely see a lot of value that could come from bioethics in the corporate affairs world. And I would say that in today's world where, honestly, I think trust and responsibility are so much in the public eye and so much under question for a lot of industry, I think that corporate responsibility becomes a real sort of strategic asset to a company. The irony is that most corporate responsibility departments, and I'm thinking of everyone that I've ever worked with, do not have any bioethicists. So I think there's a lot of value to be had, but there's also probably some education that goes on, and I think through the dialogue with you on how could bioethics apply, to the particular mission of that company, where do the circles overlap between bioethics and between the mission of the company, I think that could create a lot of positive. There are also a number of other areas though, and in that bucket, I think if you look particularly in the R&D space, there are some areas, so for example with clinical trials, I know there are, I know Professor Klitzman has a program on global clinical trials and covering at least many aspects of IRBs, many aspects of informed consent, the type of issues that typically come up in trials, data transparency, all of that. I think the bioethical lens could be very powerful in that forum. On the more of the marketing and commercial side, I could see a lot of bioethics going into, for example, pricing decisions. Okay, and there are typically departments that focus on health economics, outcomes research, on reimbursement analysis, and I think there's a lot that could be added to a company by having a bioethicist in those roles. So there's probably quite a few different roles. My sense is though that when you apply for one of these roles, and I remember having this exact dialogue with a few Columbia students from this program, bioethics is going to be part of the proposition. And I think this is an important realization that bioethics cannot be the sole, positioning. So if you're interested in a particular function, it would have to be the whole suite of things that you bring to that position, one of which is bioethics. And this goes back to, look, what are your other experiences, what are the other areas that you've been trained in, and how can that net total offer something valuable to the company. So I hope that is helpful.
Great, thank you. Do you yes, John?
So I have a question about whether in industry you encounter those who have a diminished appreciation of ethics or a naivete, and how all of us could approach that in helping others see beyond its for what for them would perhaps just be a theater for public approval, but rather ethics is a matter of right and wrong in the course of doing good.
Yeah. So, John, thank you. Very, very thoughtful question. My observation on that has been, I think you encounter people who will not, have a systematic view of ethics as you would have from this program, but you encounter them everywhere. And it may be in industry, it may be outside of industry, it may be in, all of the different peripheries of government, academia, wherever it may be. And regardless of where it is, I look at that as a great opportunity. I mean, honestly, when someone asks a question that's hasn't considered the ethical aspects, I think there are a lot of ways we can react to that. Particularly having been through this program, you can react to that and say, well, that's really irresponsible, and think about that in some critical way. But I take a step back and say, this is a great opportunity to educate. And I think the tone and how you do that becomes very important in influencing them, because if your goal is to make them look like an idiot, that's not going to win anyone over. I think sometimes you find that the best way is really to take the opportunity to say, there's some questions I'd like to ask, and I think we together need to think about, and it could be, is this fair? Is this whatever? You go back to some very simple bioethical principles, and it will naturally make them ask questions that actually bring them an appreciation, and probably make them search for bioethical questions. That's a good thing to do, because you've influenced someone and you've helped them to do something actually good for patients in the end. It is very interesting to me that there are very few bioethically trained colleagues, either in industry or anywhere else. And what I find is that once people start becoming interested and passionate about it, they will often go away and want to look at, how can they learn more? And that all depends on what level of commitment, they're willing to make. But the how can they learn more, once you've had some dialogue with someone and they're asking a question like that, it's a great victory, John. It's a great sense of, okay, someone has moved on their curve of understanding. That's a positive thing. So it's a good question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amrit. So we have a couple of questions from one of our students who's joining us online. His name is Owele, and he's asking, what role have you seen in your career so far on the impact of AI in healthcare analytics and clinical research? And would you recommend one pursues a degree in those fields before going into medicine?
Is it Owele?
Owele.
Great. Hi, Owele. Thank you very much for the thoughtful question. I didn't plant that question, by the way, but just to let you know, that's a very, I think that is so pertinent. And Owele, when we were looking at that sort of portfolio of different things that you do, the way you ask that question, it just shows, I think it just shows an innate appreciation for the portfolio of different skills that you could, bring to bear and still have a very big impact on patients, public health. Now, specifically in AI, I could pinpoint a few areas where I've personally seen and I'm seeing a dramatic difference. I could also tell you immediately that there is a huge paucity of talent, right? There's a complete talent gap in those areas. So the people that are good at that really are extremely sought after. One area is definitely in real-world evidence, and in looking at not just real-world evidence in the form of studies that are done with real-world evidence, but in looking at all of the surrounding disciplines. If you look at epidemiology, you look at some different types of health economics, outcomes research, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole series of sister disciplines that I'll broadly call real-world evidence. And in those disciplines, the challenge that you face is that you're dealing with mega data. Not big data, but whatever the next order of exponent is of big data. And big data, mega data cannot be analyzed using traditional methods that we look at in clinical trials. Big data also leads to very different ethical questions. It leads to questions that relate to, some of you will remember there was quite a famous case. I think we studied it when I was here, so a little bit old now, but related to Google's analysis of some of the public health data in the United Kingdom. And Google did a very good thing identifying some sources of potential renal injury by using signals that were in the public health data system, but the public had not given their permission for the data to be analyzed that way. There was no informed consent as such. It just led to a whole like Pandora's box, which Google probably didn't anticipate. And I think what that tells you is while AI can be incredibly powerful, I think you're in the privileged position of probably having an ethical lens on the application of that, and that will make it very powerful. The last part of your question on AI as a sort of precursor to medicine, I don't know the answer to that. I could definitely see AI playing hugely important role in medicine, no question about that. But I think what you have to think through is, there are some permutations of career path that you will want to think through, and I would need to think a little bit more about it. What's the thoughtful way of sequencing it? Because this is where a little bit of, we were talking about what is the road and what's the journey. There are certain steps in the road that make sense in a certain sequence, and I don't know enough of your personal circumstances to know what that is. I'd be very happy to have a discussion with you about it one-on-one if you want. I could definitely see value though in AI and medicine. Good question.
Great, thanks, Amrit. That was a really wonderful response, and I think a lot of us had similar questions. Even Kyle McDonald, one of our other students, said that he would like to echo Awele's question. So, Awele, great question. He also has another question where he's asking, what are the best practices on keeping and maintaining a network of contacts?
That's from Kyle. Yeah.
No. Sorry, this is again from Awele.
Awele, oh yeah, great. So, really important question, Awele. It's one of these things, we do all these lectures, we have, a lot of discussions, but what I really like about sort of the intimacy of the program and discussions in the program is that you can get into these sort of softer topics like networks. I personally have found that the network of people that you surround yourself with becomes such a vast influence on your career that it is really worth putting a bit of thought into. A few of the things I would say are best practices. And it's a little bit hard. I don't know if I'd call them best practices. I would just call them things that I've personally found to be helpful. I'm sure others have different views. You could probably poll anyone; they'll give you different points on this. But one, as I was mentioning earlier, I certainly would look at interactions as being long-term interactions. I think it's very hard to get fleeting interactions. Someone will come, nothing about them, you've never met them, you don't really have any context, and in 15 minutes you're supposed to say how to program their life. And that's a very difficult thing to do. Whereas, if you are able to maintain a dialogue with people over time, I think it gives you a lot more likelihood of having a meaningful discussion. And I'll give you an example. I have encountered times when some exciting new career opportunities come up, and I've gone to a career mentor or someone in the career network and said, "Look at this great opportunity. I'm so excited about this. Do you think I should pursue this?" And if they really know you, sometimes people have come back and said, "Well, Amrit, you've been doing very well. I have no doubt you could be successful at that opportunity. The only thing is, the last 15 years we've talked, you never said at any point that you're interested in this. And in fact, many times you said this was against the values that you thought about and you don't agree with it. I'm sure you could make a lot of money and be very successful and all the things that look attractive on paper, but it isn't consistent with what you said." And that's what you really need, people who will come back and I think say to you, act as a mirror and help you be, very, very sort of self-aware and thoughtful about it. So that's one thing, long term. I think another thing is I would be very deliberate about open-mindedness to diverse perspectives, and It's easy to think, if you're, all right, I'm going to pursue a career in medicine, I should talk to all these medical people, or AI, I should talk to all these technology people and so forth. But I've just found immeasurable value from speaking to people with diverse viewpoints. And that's when you realize, look, there are great careers in government, there are great careers in academia, there are great careers in small companies, large companies, there are just so many permutations of career that the more diverse viewpoints you get, the more you are likely to sort of have ingredients with which to make a recipe. And I think that becomes really important. I think that the last thing I would say is that when it comes to networking, there are a lot of tools that are available now. People, I'm sure, people are, using LinkedIn, and feel free to, reach out to me. I will always be responsive to that. But in the end, I also find that tools like LinkedIn and others, they can be a little bit anonymous. And the reality of programs like this, and I think, being at an institution like this, is that you're in such a rich ecosystem. I am sure that if you asked, Samir, look, is there someone in the law department and the law faculty that I could speak to, it would take minutes and they would be able to identify that. And the reality is, when you're out in the big wide world, outside of an institution, it is a lot harder to do that. So I think it's important to try and use some form of connection other than like an unsolicited social media outreach. I would just encourage that wherever possible. It's probably a richer relationship that comes from it. So a few thoughts. I hope they're helpful. Well, a good question.
Great, thank you. Amrit, there's a question from Dr. Klitzman, and he's asking, where do you see major growth areas in the pharmaceutical industry in the future?
Great question. Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Klitzman. That's a great. I think that's a great thing to think about with a view to how to build skills and what areas merit training. I can throw a few out there. I certainly think. If you look like purely in the scientific domain, there are a number of different areas where we're seeing growth. It's all fairly recent. If you look at, for example, gene therapies, if you look at, for example, combination therapies, where you've got multiple agents being used together. If you look at, for example, combination drug device therapies, I could see a lot more of that in the future. Now, when you look at that, you think, okay, they're going to have combination therapies. What does that mean for me? What do I do with my career as a result of that? And what it goes back to is thinking about the skill sets that then become useful for such careers. So, analytical skills, biostatistical skills, skills that, I think to the earlier question, are tied into using technology in a very facile way. That becomes particularly important. So, I was once in this discussion where someone was asking me, does the company have a digital strategy? And we stepped back from that and said, look, every company is a digital company today. There's no company with a digital strategy. That's a little bit outmoded. So I think being very facile with technology would probably bring you into a stronger place for those particular areas. Another area, to go back to what I was saying with real-world evidence, another area that I think is going to become more and more important is the ability to use very large-scale data in a simple, repeatable, scientifically valid way. And the recognition that a lot of the skills to do that are not where they need to be today. It's sort of a space that's still gray, and there's an opportunity. My guess is that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that will probably be different. And if I was, starting a career now, I would definitely look at that in a very, very, deliberate way and say, wow, what could I do to be part of that? What could I do to contribute to that? only, I think the only other thing that I would say that I think has been very exciting from my perspective is that the world feels a lot flatter today in terms of geographical reach than it may have been, 10 or 20 years ago. And I can only see that increasing. So for example, your ability to do something that will influence people in corners of the world that you probably didn't anticipate is extraordinary. Certainly, technology has a role to play, but it is extraordinary. And when you look at the opportunity set, I would try to take a very broad view on that. And you find that, the health needs in different areas of the world are incredibly, I think, needy, incredibly in need of someone who can go and make a difference. And you have the opportunity to do that. So if you can build up a little bit of global experience, I think it can open up career doors that would be very exciting. I've spoken to a few people recently who have been eagerly learning Mandarin. Now, I don't have the capabilities to do that, but if there are those in the class who do, I would certainly encourage that. And I can tell you, I have kids who are, thinking what they want to do, and before we start the conversation, I say, learn Mandarin, then we'll have a discussion. And I really mean that, because I believe that's going to be an important influence in the future. So a few different perspectives.
Great, thank you, Amrit. And so I had a question. I was wondering if you could maybe speak to, I know you've alluded to this and you've spoken about this before, about the importance of highlighting transferable skills, that our students need to kind of highlight certain skills that they have, that they've had, that they've developed through the program. So can you speak a little bit to that, and also kind of maybe highlight which skills you think our program helps students really develop that they can then speak to?
Yeah, Samir, thank you. It's a great question, and I think particularly, as you reach the end of a program, you want to start thinking, okay, what comes next? And I think that causes you to go back and try and pick out a few things. This program actually offers a lot, and I think there are a few things have stood out to me, and I've had a similar discussion with a few people that have come one-on-one, and we've ended up, trying to sort of work on how they position themselves. One is definitely that there is exposure to a set of critical thinking skills, which, every time you're looking at, one of Professor Kuflik's papers or something like that and being pressure tested, you probably quickly realize that you have thought about 5% of what he's going to talk about. Right? And this is very, very important, because by the time you get to the end of the program, you might be at 6%. And, continuing to evolve that is going to be very, very important. So critical thinking skills, I think the exposure to healthcare, that's also something which is important, because you've probably seen a lot of different facets of healthcare. And the reality is, this isn't an ethics program, it's a bioethics program. And that's very different. If you start looking up ethics programs, so you've done a form of specialization already. And I would speak to that. You understand matters of pricing, matters of, equitable access, etc. I think another thing I would speak to is that a lot of the program here ties into faculty members that have come from different parts of Columbia, the greater institution. Right? And I think that gives you an opportunity to say, look, I've done something in conjunction with the law school as follows. I have an appreciation for policy, for legislation, for implementation of legislation in real life, and some examples of that. But that gives you see, imagine you're applying for something that relates to government or policy development, right? The State Department or whatever it may be. That type of experience becomes very pertinent, and I think those are a few of the things that I've seen standing out. And students that have been able to position their experience in a little bit more of a pointed way end up, I think, doing themselves a great favor in positioning. The other thing, Samir, is most people, are coming to this program with a set of, very diverse other experiences. And I think that's important because the complementarity of this program with their other experiences needs to be the positioning. It can't be, look, I did this program and that's my entire positioning. There's a lot of other things that people have typically done. And, can you make it more than the sum of the parts? Can you make it, somehow cohesive? And that takes a lot of thought. I mean, I don't think you sit down and do that by yourself. And my advice would be, this is where you really need a few thought partners who are going to be objective, who can say, look, your totality of skills adds up to this. Have you ever thought about this? Have you ever thought about that? That's very important. And you're in an institution where you have a lot of thoughtful people. Just by the process of osmosis, you are going to pick up a lot of high power thought. So I would certainly encourage that.
Yes, Professor Keepley.
Well, I hadn't thought of this till hearing you relay your experience in China, how important health awareness, health education is. And then I was making this connection that a lot of what pharma does is deliver to people after a lot of effort, not all in a flash, something that they can take and is kind of, they hope, a magic bullet or something like that, right? And then I was thinking, well, maybe at the surface, these two things are at odds. People being better educated and realizing that a lot of what they do in their diet, in their exercise, whatever, or maybe an occasional medicine, may be at odds with the idea that what we really need is the next magic bullet or something like that. But then I was thinking maybe we could reconcile these things, that pharma, like companies such as yours, committed to educating people, maybe would help too. They would realize you can't get these things overnight. It takes a lot of time to get a high standard of safety and efficacy and all that, and to be better to know when you need to go and see a doctor to see, do I need this now? I'm having a lot of inflammation. It doesn't seem to go down. Is there something that will help my body help itself, and so forth? So that the idea of a well-educated public is not really against the idea that sometimes you need to turn to pharma, and maybe the idea that there are complications or side effects. People would appreciate what pharma does. Absolutely. If they were better educated. They would do more for themselves even before they need the benefits of pharma, but maybe they would also understand and value what goes into what pharma has to do and how they do it. Just a wild thought. I don't know if you'd...
Well, I think that's a great thought, and let me just offer a reflection on that, and then I'm going to have to end because I know that we're out of time. So it is a wonderful, wonderful thought, and I think it takes a much broader view on certainly the biopharmaceutical industry, but on a lot of healthcare. And I'll give you a specific example to bring this to life, where recently we have been working on a program, and I'm very passionate about this program. It's just recently launched, and some of you may get to experience it yourself. And it actually is a program with Emirates Airlines. And you may think, well, wait a minute, what has a pharmaceutical company and an aviation company got in common? It's not a natural combination, right? But the reality is that in the case of Emirates Airlines, they have a very strong focus on wellness. Okay? And you go from well care, on the spectrum of well care to sort of health care through to sick care. And a lot of pharma has been focused on sick care. And we, after a lot of sort of discussions with them, realized that actually there's a very powerful impact we can make on health literacy and on well care through the knowledge that we have about sick care. We worked with Emirates and worked with the Ministry of Health in the UAE, and then also worked with a design studio that no doubt uses a lot of incredible AI that you can see in action, but it uses some deep science that we understand well to develop education modules that are now available on all Emirates airlines around the world. The minute you sit down in the chair and switch on, the in-cabin entertainment, it becomes apparent to you that there are modules on depression. There are modules on high blood pressure. There are modules on, a variety of different conditions. And the intent of them is, we were very sensitive that you don't want to scare people on an airplane. That's the last thing that we don't. We don't want to induce an illness on an airplane. But at the same time, that is also an audience that is selected, the desire to be informed, to be educated, they would like to learn. And by the way, the pickup for this program, has exceeded all expectations. And Emirates is saying, look, this is beating some of our top movies and comedies and so forth, because people are really eager. And when you look at that and you look at the impact of that, a lot of people will go away and say, okay, I understand now to control my hypertension, I really need to be thinking about diet differently. I really need to be thinking about how I exercise differently. The stress levels in my life are not where they should be. Do I understand my own family heredity in the way that I could learn from, and so on and so on. There's a lot of different aspects of that. And lifting the literacy curve, it does a lot of positive things, I think, for healthcare. It may be that some people take more antihypertensives. It may be that they don't because they don't develop hypertension. And if they don't, personally, I would be thrilled. The best patient is someone who never becomes a patient. And I think through that, we've developed such a strong collaboration with the Ministry of Health, with others, that it really builds trust that we have, similar goals. And, the impact that we've had in terms of just doing something very positive for the public, I think has been so uplifting and positive for our employees. They will stay late. They will work weekends. They will put heart and soul into this. And when you see the program, it's called Dr. Adam, and there's a series of other characters that relay this education. You realize that it's the combination of these multiple disciplines that are coming together to analyze what is it that flyers look at and so on. And I think it's something that I think will have a positive impact overall on healthcare.
I feel like getting on one of those planes now.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, look, thank you thank you just for the chance to have a conversation and not do a presentation. And I really think there are great opportunities in this program. I think there are great career opportunities, and I hope that we stay in a dialogue. And if I can help in some way, I'd be very happy.
Great. Thank you, Amrit, and thank you. Please help join me. Thank you, Amrit.
My pleasure.
Thank you, and I'd also like to thank Alex Cleveland, his Chief of Staff, who's here with us today, and we look forward to continuing this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Samir. Thanks, Alex.
And of course, thank you to everyone here and everyone who joined us via live stream and your questions. Thank you.